Dear colleagues, dear paper presenters, all participants of this special session devoted to the 72nd anniversary of the Korean War, which began right on this day, on June 25th of 1950, and the name of our session is, the shortened name is Coexistence in Contact Zone, Division and the War. So the first paper presenter will be two persons, Professor Min Kyung-hyung from the Korea University and Ekaterina Nacharova, who represents Russian Academy of Sciences, now in Russia. She is online with us, and she is ready to present our first paper, which name is The Korean Question at the Moscow Conference in 1945. So, Ekaterina, are you ready? If you are ready, so please.
I'm ready. Good morning, dear colleagues, and thank you for this opportunity to present my papers. And thank you for the opportunity to join your conference panel. Can I share the screen yet for the presentation? One moment, please. Can we see it? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, the question of the fate of Korea and Korean Peninsula after the war, the Second World War, we can see wasn't the main problem as for the Soviet government at the spring of 1945. Yeah, they had a lot of different problems on the European direction of the foreign policy and the diplomacy. Yes, so first of all, I think we need to discuss these concrete steps, concrete plans on the Korea state after the end of the war in Europe, and as you know, it's the first discussions on the problems was had at Yalta conference, but after that we can see the beginning of preparation, some projects, some plans on the fate of Korea. So the main purpose of my work here, the presentation of these logical steps, step by step, or the projects of the Soviet Union, the changing of their position or not changing maybe on this question. So first of all, we can see that the most important part about the political problems, that was the main interest of the Soviet government and the Soviet bureaucracy, the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs and Milkomata Mostamdil, at that time in 1945, I suppose. So, first of all, my research based on the documents of the archive of the Foreign Ministry. That's the problem. Is, as you know, that we can be granted the full access to the documents. So during my research, I can't really, find the papers on these, the concrete plans. Only some projects. First of the project that I can, really see in the documents, that was the June 45 project by the members of the first Far Eastern Department of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That was the first draft of some possible future government of Korea. And as you can see, first of all, this project was really very vague. We can see some kind of this, deliberate steps or some concrete plans about what the Soviet government would want to do with the Korean Peninsula. What they want to achieve there in concrete. But first of all, this document shows a lot of concerns about the possible political preparations of the new Korean government. And first of all, it had some kind of the big historical aspect of the Russian interest in Korea. So it had some kind of retrospective of Russian policy there, and as we can see, the most important part there, that Russian imperialistic interests, they were justified since the 19th century. So the Soviet Union also need to create some position, to deliver some position on that question. And first of all, yes, the first and most important goal was to expel Korea, Japan from Korea. Yes, so to create some kind of this friendly government. That wasn't really a plan or the description of this friendly government, but we also can see that in the words of my colleagues from the Institute of Slavic Studies from Russian Academy of Science, that was really very similar to some plans about the Eastern European countries at the summer of 45. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, indeed, they didn't really, create this some kind of this step-by-step projects. So that was the first and most important goal. Yes, the creation of a friendly state, friendly government. But as we can see, yes, this term friendly can mean, first of all, the socialistic government or something neutral, at least. Yes. So. This is also very interesting that this report mentions not only Japan but also other countries. So Japan's influence should be decreased or eliminated, expelled from Korea, and at the same time it should be noted that not any other government should be, not, can be like to create some kind of this stronghold in Korea. Yes, so we can see this talents plan, this the ideas of creating this friendly state, the securing their territory and boundaries. But first of all, of course, that was the most important. And at the same time, we can see that here this is the first mentions of this in the Soviet documents, the first mention of the trusteeship that should be established as that was discussed previously, yes, at Yalta. And if the possibility of creating the trusteeship would be achievable, so Soviet Union should must first of all participate in it, and these documents, as I can see, that was first vote plan, but as we also can see these ideas about the creating the friendly government became this milestone, yes, of the Soviet position on the Korean question as a whole. So, of course, it was closely connected to the other problems of forest and foreign policy. First of all, of course, the fate of Japan and the problem of this the Soviet participation in this possible participation in the Japan post-war political life. Yes, so, but we also can see that Stalin's position and the position of the foreign ministry, that was obviously the reflection of Stalin's ideas about the foreign interests of the Soviet Union. It wasn't really articulated even at the first meeting of Council of Foreign Ministers. That wasn't really successful. It wasn't were not discussed the Far Eastern questions, problems at all. But we also can see that in the preparation materials for the first meeting in London, there wasn't really a lot of documents on Korea. Yes, the preparation documents on Japan and some preparation materials, but not much for the Korean question, really. And the discussion that Stalin had with Abu Harman is at autumn of 1945. After the breakup of the first meeting at London, that was also concentrated on the Japanese questions and not on the fate of Korea, so they really didn't discuss it deliberately. But the first preparations of the real steps on the possible discussion, the future discussion between the winners and the World War on the Korean question, we can see in this American documents that was sent the question that was sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at autumn of 1945, and we can see that American proposals were really more practical, and that was the problem for the Soviet diplomats, for the foreign ministry, because the idea about the discussions and practical moments were, as I can understand, for the Soviet diplomats and Stalin, but first of all for the ministry, that was wasn't possible without the global discussion on the political situation. So that was the main problem. That was the first issue, yes, for the Soviet diplomats on that moment, and the ideas about American proposals. It was very interesting because they really wanted some instructions from Molotov, and as you can see, the proposals on the social and economic issues that Molotov instructed the members of the Forest and Department. It was the idea about some kind of the folk answer. So first of all, in this answer, yes, we knew that the ministry answered to these proposals that nothing of these questions could be discussed without these the meeting of the political leaders on the Korean question, and only after that we can see the possible fulfillment of these problems that Americans were interested in. So the idea of social and economic reconnection of two occupied zones wasn't really the first hand or in mind of the Soviet government at that step. Of course, because of these strong and deliberate intention to create, first of all, to create this pro-Soviet or neutral, at least, government. And in the documents, in the preparations for the Moscow conference, we can see that proposals that were prepared for Molotov, yes, for the next meeting of the Soviet and American ministers of foreign affairs in Moscow, that was scheduled for the December of 1945. That was a very interesting idea because also we can see that in Malin's document we can't find any concrete ideas or steps. First of all, of course, they should declare the independence of Korea and support it. And the idea about the establishment of the provisional government, yes, so the idea of the creation of this new pro-Soviet or neutral government should be discussed, but the steps about the creating this government, it wasn't really, some deliberate thing. So we can see the possibilities that Malik prepared. So maybe it should be the interim committee to prepare the Constituent Assembly. It's People's Constituent Assembly, especially bear in mind that yes, the ideas of people's committees, they were realized at the northern zone of occupation. Yes, it is north of Korea, and so this. We can see that that was the main idea, the transfer of these structures, these institutions to the south, or at least trying to do this. Yes, and so the ideas about hold meetings with the Korean civic organization, political bodies, it also was, the transferring these, procedures that were held in the north at autumn of 45. And so the last point is the idea about the forming some kind of the alliance commission with representatives of the USSR and the United States. That was really interesting because it wasn't, as I can see, it wasn't really these, these trusteeship body, because it really should include only two powers, not the standards that were discussed at Yalta. After that, only USSR and the United States, excluding Great Britain and other countries. And it is really interesting because from Stalin agreed, yes, with the idea of the trusteeship, and after the beginning of the Moscow Conference, Soviet Union became the main advocate of this idea. But at the same time, in the preparation materials, Stalin stressed that that it would be very difficult, really, to participate in such kind of the body, such kind of the institution, because of the problem of the votes. Yes, they had in this possible institution, they had only one vote. So that would be preferable to create some kind of this commission, excluding other countries. And we can see that Malik's proposals were really some kind of this they were reviewed by the members of the Far Eastern Division, and at the beginning of the Moscow Conference, we can see this document really as the main. And we can see that here the idea of the Soviet American Commission was the main step that the Soviet Union could possibly propose for the participants, as for the ministers of foreign affairs. And at the same time, they also mentioned these commission of representatives of all these interested countries. Yes. So here we can see the first real step-by-step plan how to do it and what would meant to the creation of this joint commission. As we can see, the idea of this joint commission concentrated on these current issues. So that was the institution that possibly could deal with the problems of this social economic problems, with the problems that American government declared in their letters at November of 1946. And At the same time, the members of the Trust division mentioned that it couldn't be possible to create the Korean interim government without the participation of other countries, not only the Soviet Union and the United States, but that commission should be the Great Britain and China if they should be represented here. And so also we can see this, the problems, the possibility of creating some kind of this local government. How that could be possible done, that wasn't really deliberate, so that was only the proposal as for the discussion. As I can see from the text, that was also trying to transfer these procedures from the northern North Korea to the south, really. But at the same time, that was stressed that it should be done with the assistance of both sides. Yes. So that was the great, for the discussion. And about the trusteeship, that was also mentioned here. And it was really stressed there by a lot of these words about the idea of trusteeship has been neither widespread dissatisfaction. So,
Yekaterina, time is over. Time is over. Excuse me. Please terminate your presentation. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, as I can understand this, so I need to end the presentation. So I can, answer the question maybe. Sorry if you have one. But to end this, I need to mention that the ideas of trusteeship and the understanding of this, the really difficult situation, difficult difficulties of the work with the public opinion on this question in Korea, that was really understood by the Soviet government. But at the same time, the Korean problem at the Moscow conference was really closely connected with this, the issue of Japan's interest and the Japan question. And we can see really from the documents of the conference itself, they really trade the points of these proposals for for solving not only the Korean but also the Japanese or even Italian questions about and Romanian questions. But I think I don't have time. Yes,
Thank you. It's
to say about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation, and I should like to ask all paper presenters to keep time, to give more possibilities for people who are in the hall to ask questions and to keep discussion about presentation. So we don't have many time, so maybe one or two questions to Ekaterina about the paper she presented here. Somebody in the floor, please.
I do have a question. It seems that you relied solely on the Foreign Ministry archive, is that right? The Archiv Внешней политики. Because there actually is quite a bit in Stalin's Lichny Fond now, as well as in the in Suslow's Lichny Fund at Rigani, which I believe is Fund 81, but Stalin's at Rigaspi, which is 558. And so take a look there, because there were files released there within the last 2 to 3 years that do pertain to 1945 conferences. I don't remember specifically, because I was looking more at what they, with regard to Japan, but there definitely is material there about the role of or the impact of the conference on the settlement in Korea and the division of the peninsula. So, but the question I had for you is, you mentioned that that the questions of Korea and Japan were connected, whereas I don't really see that. I mean, I think both the Soviet Union and the United States treated Japan quite differently, and I'm not sure I would describe those two issues as being connected. So what exactly did you mean by that, Katerina?
Thank you. Please answer as short as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. So, first of all, thank you for your advice. And yes, I know about those documents in Uganda, but you know, so I had the possibility I had a great possibility to look for the documents there. But about the connection, I think first of all that was connection between these, the possibility of discussion, the possibility of, not trading, some kind, but I can see through these, reports that the question of Korean future were not the main problem. So the documents on Japan, the proposals on Japan, they had a lot of documents really preparing materials at the foreign minister. But we can see that each time when the discussion about the Korea began among these, the members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they mentioned Japan, yes, and the idea about the future. First of all, we need to solve the problem of the Japanese future, and Japan also constantly stressed as the potential enemy. So that was my main point. So first of all, we need to set up the future for Japan, and after that, we can see what we can do with Korea and how we can discuss it with the other members of Council.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you. We don't have enough time, so I propose for those who want to ask Ekaterina about her presentation to chat her, or maybe send her later some emails, because we have 4 more paper presenters who are waiting for their time to tell us about results of their research. So thank you, Ekaterina. Sorry for interrupting you, but we have already spent about 40 minutes.
I'm really sorry for
40 minutes instead of 24 minutes, so it's too much for our conference. Sorry. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, very important because you used primary sources. So our next paper presenter will be Dr. Mark Kramer. Yes, and he will tell us about...
Can I hook this up for the PowerPoint?
Yes. Have you sent your paper
I did send
to organizers?
I believe I did. definitely did send it, but I don't know where it is.
I think that organizers have, and so I can start.
I sent it in advance, but
So, and while solving technical questions,
This be connected to here?
just for
If not, I can do it without the PowerPoint.
어떤 걸로 보실 거예요? 이거요?
So I have a proposal to put the paper of Dr. Mark Kramer on the third place, because during we are solving the technical problems and putting his presentation into the online. So the next paper presenter,
Well, I also need my PowerPoint.
you also need, but all the paper organizers, they have your
I did send
Paper, but not the
Yes.
I sent
PowerPoint.
on the
out a
PowerPoint.
couple of
How do
weeks
I
ago.
project, how do I use the PowerPoint? Okay, on here it's called Moscow Sphere of Japan.
So I can use this one, I think, to turn pages and so our second paper presenter will be Dr. Catherine Weathersby from Georgetown University in the United States, and she will tell us about Moscow's fear of Japan and the improvised division of Korea in 1945-1946. Just what Ekaterina told us about Russian fear or concern about Japan, Dr. Catherine Weatherby will tell us during her presentation. So just let us connect her USB memory card to the computer and let us begin.
I sent mine.
You sent it, I saw your presentation.
I sent it a couple of weeks ago.
It's 21st century, we still have problems with PowerPoint. It's just strange.
Oh, here
I
it is,
hear,
it's up.
yes,
But
yes.
I need to.
Oh, yeah, good.
Can I see it through this computer too?
Yeah, if we show it there, then I'll. Oh, standing up there?
I still
Yeah.
must be looking.
Okay. Well, let me,
We are short of time.
well, yeah, but I need to be able to see.
Leaving the presentation.
Oh, and then I can see.
can
Oh,
see.
much better, much better.
The organizer
All right.
asked you to try to
Be brief.
limit the presentation within 15 minutes if you.
Okay, is this microphone working?
I think it's working.
Is this
Not working.
not working?
Not working,
Okay.
only this one. If you hold this microphone.
Okay, so turn that off. And how am I? Here we go.
Maybe
All right.
it's working, maybe it's more convenient. It doesn't.
This is fine.
So you can use
Yeah. This one.
Page, it's better. It's more-
All right. We have such fancy technology and sometimes more fancy than our brains. I don't know. So it's nice to be with you this morning. Let me jump right in and start with the observation about borderlands that borderlands are often places of fear because one group of people confronts another group of people and become worried about them, create kind of worst case scenarios about their goals, what they intend. And this is very much the case with Korea as a borderland of Russia. So that's the theme of my presentation. Starts with the acquisition of the Ussuri territory in 1860, which brought the Russian border all the way down here to the border with Korea. The problem with acquiring additional territory is that then we worry somebody's going to try to get it from us. Right? It's this basic phenomenon, you know? Or we buy a beautiful new house and then we worry somebody will break into it. It's the same sort of, you know, phenomenon on the part of countries. So once Russia got the Ussuri territory all the way down here, they started worrying. First, the worry was that the British might get these important bays, but then the worry shifted to China, that China would make Korea completely a colony of China, and that would put China right here threatening these important bays, one that became Vladivostok. So it's that basic, you know, dynamic, right? We worry about losing what we've just gotten. Then, of course, here's a larger picture of the expansion of the Russian Empire. You know, first over to Siberia, then with the Amur territory from China, and then down all the way to the Korean border in 1860. Yeah. By the way, Russia persuaded China to cede it the Ussuri territory by reference to China's fear that of Britain, because of course Britain had been the great threat to China in the 19th century. And so the Russians made the argument, better for us to have it than the British. And with the British occupying Beijing in 1860, that worked, that argument. So then, of course, Japan's defeat of China in 1884-85 shifted the focus of concern to Japan. One of the things Russia did in response to that was to strengthen its position in Manchuria, so surrounding Korea. So they built this branch line of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, you see it here, and then another branch line coming all the way down to the Liaodong Peninsula and developed these important ports, Port Arthur and Dairen. So now Russia is surrounding Korea, you know, to the north, on all of its boundaries to the north. Once Russia did that, then Korea, as is quite obvious from this map, became a borderland between Japan and Russia. Right. Initially, the response of both powers was to try to establish equilibrium between them with regard to Korea. So they concluded an agreement in 1896 that clarified the level of troop presence each of them would have in Korea. It's interesting to note that in these discussions, the initial proposal by Japan was that Korea would be divided at the 38th parallel, strangely enough. The northern part be considered the Russian zone and the southern part the Japanese zone. Russia refused this proposal, however, the reason being that it was establishing Vladivostok as its naval base in the Pacific, which of course it still is. And so the important thing for Russia is to be able to freely access the Korean Straits here so that they can make their way all the way down to these ports they were developing at the tip of Liaodong. So the southern part of Korea became very important for Russia. So it would not agree to Japan's proposal to divide. Yeah. The Chine Naval Base is an illustration of the importance of the southern part of Korea. If you go to Russia, if you go to the base today, you will notice the building that the commander of the base uses as his headquarters looks distinctly European, turn of the century European. And in fact, it was built by Russia when Russia leased Chine at the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah. This equilibrium between Russia and Japan over Korea was, of course, broken in the War of 1904-05. Here are some Russian naval officers, prisoners of Japan in 1904. The famous catastrophe of the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, December of 1904. Despite these losses, Russia did not consider itself defeated in this war against Japan, and so the negotiations at Portsmouth, mediated by U.S. President Roosevelt, here he is, right here, were very tense, right? The end result, however, was that Russia did agree to recognize Korea as in Japan's sphere. The main reason it did so was really not so much the military losses as the diplomatic losses, because Japan had managed to get an alliance with Britain, and also the United States supported Japan's aspirations in Korea. And so Russia was faced with support for Japan from both Britain and the United States, and in face of that, they considered it hopeless to try to resist Japan's goals. And then also they ended up ceding southern Sakhalin and the southern part of the railroad. So it was a very severe loss for Russia. It's worth spending some time thinking about Treaty of Portsmouth, because in 1945, reversing the losses from this treaty was Stalin's goal as he entered the war against Japan. So this became the touchstone for Stalin's policy in the East. But before we get to 1945, I want to emphasize additional reasons why Japan figured so largely in Soviet concerns for the Far East. When the Tsarist government fell in 1917, Japan took advantage of that chaos to send troops to Vladivostok. Here's a photo of them entering. These troops occupied the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the Siberian portion of it, for 4 years. That's really quite a long time, occupying all the major cities of Siberia. They didn't withdraw until U.S. pressure forced them to. Even after they withdrew, fear of Japan returning again to Siberia was so intense that Russia expelled all Korean communists who had taken refuge in Soviet territory. Here's a picture of this. Oh, yes, of course. Here we go. The PowerPoint was not being shared. Yeah, the Congress of Toilers of the Far East, 1922, very large Korean contingent. But they were, the ones who were Korean nationals were thrown out of Soviet territory for fear that they would do something that would spark a Japanese attack on the Soviet Union. The Comintern continued, however, to maintain contact with them and supervision over them because of the importance of Korea to Japan. And then in 1931, of course, the invasion of Manchuria raised the profile of Japan in Moscow, intensified their fears for their own security in the Far East. One consequence of this was that Stalin ordered all Korean nationals or all ethnic Koreans in the Soviet Far East deported to Central Asia in 1937 for the same reason that he expelled the communists in 1922, for fear that they would do something to, give a pretext for Japan to attack the Soviet Union. That's a very long way they were sent, isn't it? So they were moved far away from, Japan. Throughout the 1930s, the Soviet government was getting constant intelligence reports that Japan intended to attack Siberia in order to get oil for its war industry. And then finally, in 1939, a major battle did occur at this borderland where Mongolia and Manchuria and Russia meet. This battle was a victory of the Soviet army, and it was only after that victory then that Japan decided against invading Siberia in favor of moving south down toward Indonesia for its oil. But even though it did that, the Soviets remained extremely concerned about Japanese aggression. And so in April 41 concluded a neutrality pact so that they would not have to fight both Japan and Germany at the same time. So at the Yalta Conference, we have to keep in mind that this is the background of Stalin's thinking with regard to Korea. So he defined his goal as a return of territories lost in 1905. That did not directly relate to Korea because it had never been a Russian territory, right? But also at Yalta, he agreed verbally to Roosevelt's idea for trusteeship, perhaps because that appeared to be a return to the earlier policy of balancing power on the peninsula. At Potsdam, the decision for the Soviet army to enter Korea was a very simple one. The Americans had been desperate for the Soviets to enter the war against Japan ever since the day after Pearl Harbor. This is the Soviet attack that finally happened in August of 1945. The Americans were coming up from the south. They could not they couldn't reach the Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea. So it was very important to the US that Soviet forces move across the Trans-Siberian down overland into Manchuria and Korea. However, that was clear to the military leaders, but by August of 1945, political leaders in Washington became very concerned about the Soviet takeover of the areas of Eastern Europe that the Red Army occupied. It's a great cartoon, don't you think? And because Korea was analogous to Poland as a borderland, there was concern, right, about the Soviets establishing a completely communist government in Korea, just as they had done in Poland. The reason that was problematical for the Americans was not because of Korea itself, it was because of Japan. Japan. This is what both major powers are looking. Naturally, Japan was the serious military threat. Of course they were concerned about Japan. And so the fear was that a communist Korea would embolden the Communist Party in Japan and make it more likely that Japan would end up under communist rule and be added to the Soviet zone. That was the issue for the Americans. I won't talk about the Moscow Conference because Professor Necharova did an excellent job of that. But I will note that before the Moscow Conference, the Russian occupation authorities, here they are here with this young fellow who had been in the Russian army in Khabarovsk during the war, brought back to lead their zone. They established very soon governing structure in the north so that at least the northern half of Korea could be relied upon as a buffer zone against Japan, against a future remilitarized Japan, regardless of how the negotiations with the Americans over some kind of government for Korea ended up. Yeah. Moscow Conference. And then, as we all know, the Joint Commission that was set up following the agreement reached at the Moscow Conference failed. The reason it failed was actually pretty simple. The Soviets and the Americans had mutually exclusive goals in Korea. The Soviets wanted to be sure Korea would be a reliable buffer against Japanese attack. The Americans wanted to be sure Korea would be a reliable buffer against a communization of Japan. Opposite goals, so of course they could not agree on a government. I'll just end with one observation regarding borderlands. This pattern of Russian fear for the security of its eastern border relating to Korea is very deep, as we can see from what I've just said. The logic of it is very simple, and it's been consistent over a long period of time. When we look at other borderlands around the world where this pattern of fear for security has diminished, we can look, for example, at the French-German border. Right? We can see that this pattern of fear only ended when the border was enclosed in a larger security zone. Now, the prospect of that happening in Northeast Asia seems very remote. Nonetheless, as we think about that possibility, we can at least start with an understanding of how things got to be the way they are in Northeast Asia. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So you had some questions from the floor, from colleagues, and you are welcome. So please raise your hand and ask about what Dr. Letterby presented us here. Just it's very interesting view on Russian or Soviet position on Korean question at that time. Personally, I never thought about it because as a former Soviet citizen, I always thought that the Soviet Union was very proud of defeat of Japan, and it was. Yeah, thank you.
In that light, what do you think, Catherine, this does not pertain directly to Korea, but you brought up the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. What do you think, until the very end, both sides respected that, and why do you think that was?
Fear, desperate fear on the part of Moscow of fighting a two-front war, desperate fear on Japan's part of, what happened in August 1945 happening. So they both respected the military strength of the other, and they were determined not to take on more than they could manage in this war. Yeah.
But even during those first 6 months after the German attack on the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union seemed particularly vulnerable at that point, why did Japan refrain from taking advantage of that, particularly because Hitler certainly thought Japan would?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't studied the Japanese decision-making during this time, so I can't really answer with any, expertise. But I would just point out that Japan was busy moving south and preparing to take on the Americans. So I think it probably was just, if they were going to have the oil fields in Indonesia, they could manage without Siberia, and why risk, war with the Soviet Union? Even a weakened Soviet Union, would just make their war more complicated, is my sense.
So we don't have enough time. If there are any other questions here, just one question to the paper presenter, you're welcomed. You thought my just one comment, because Japan was engaged in Sino-Japanese war, and Japan was not very successful in China at that time. So maybe they have not enough power to begin any conflict or any war with the Soviet Union to be engaged, because
Right.
the Chinese situation was
right.
very, very complicated at that time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's also true, not just going south of China, but also the war in China itself
Yes.
was very, very
They
difficult
were
and absorbed a lot
not
of
successful
Japanese-
as they planned
Yeah.
in China.
absorbed a lot of Japanese troops.
Thank you. The next paper presenter will be Dr. Mark Kramer. So please, if you can, just try to limit your presentation within 15 minutes.
Let me begin with something that doesn't count toward my time, which
Thank
with
you.
regard to borderlands, which Catherine rightly brought up because it's a larger conference, is I am running a project. It hasn't begun yet, so I'm running a project with Tommaso Piffer of the University of Udine in Italy on borderlands. And borderlands in Europe and Northeast Asia. So Korea is very much a part of that. There will be a workshop in Udine in March of next year, and then a larger conference in 2024. So if anyone's interested in submitting, and travel costs and the like will be covered. So if anyone's interested in submitting a proposal for that, I can send you the announcement. It was put on various websites in, I think, about 7 or 8 weeks ago. And so as I say, it will cover both Europe and Northeast Asia. And the idea in Northeast Asia in particular is to deal extensively with Korea, but also with Soviet, Chinese, and then Soviet-Japanese borders. It'll be definitely focused on Northeast Asia, and so we'll be leaving out some of the more recent issues in Southeast Asia. But so if anyone's interested in that, and it's during the Cold War period predominantly, so I can forward to you just either give me an email address or some other means of conveying it to you. So today, now my time begins, today I'm going to be talking about a topic that I have looked at in the last year or two, partly from the Bulgarian archives, which I have spent a fair amount of time in Bulgaria over the last 2 years during the pandemic. And I'm very pleased and I'm grateful to Professor Min that he resurrected this session, which we were supposed to have exactly 2 years ago. And of course, it was at that point thwarted by the pandemic, which thwarted many other things. And it did make the conduct of archival research in Moscow and in most other countries impossible for a while, because either archives were closed or travel was impractical. The Russian archives, though, were closed only relatively briefly. It wasn't really possible to go there until last, I believe it was June. But I did spend a fair amount of time and have worked there over the last 30 years. But particularly over the last 6 to 8 months prior to the start of the war, in looking at the archives there. And one of the topics that I was dealing with was the question that is up here: Soviet espionage, Sino-Soviet relations in the outbreak of the Korean War. I'll get to some of these archival collections in a talk this afternoon, a separate session this afternoon, so I'm not going to say too much here. I'll try to focus instead on some of the issues that have come up, and I thought I had 30 minutes, but now finding out, I'll do my best to compress it. So after Second World War, the Korean Peninsula was divided. This is very familiar to everyone. And that's the way it stood basically at the late 1940s, that border clashes were going on, and again, some of those border clashes are of great interest for the Borderlands Project, if anyone is interested. And again, this is familiar to everyone, that the Soviet Union initially dissuaded Kim Il-sung from launching an attack against South Korea, but events in 1949 and early 1950 induced Stalin to shift in favor of a North Korean invasion. Catherine Weathersby published a working paper in the Cold War International History Project a long time ago, about 25, maybe even more years ago on this topic. And the documents that are contained there are still very useful to go through. Those are extremely important records of conversations that Stalin was having. Others emerged subsequently. Documents that have recently come to light from the former Soviet Union and from China, and again, I did work in the Chinese archives, but then starting around 2017 or so, it was much less useful working there. One of the negative consequences of Xi Jinping's rule is that the archival situation, which was not great, but it wasn't bad. It was especially at some of the municipal archives, the Shanghai Municipal Archive, where you could find copies of a lot of central Chinese records, that archive stopped giving me the records that I had already looked at in around 2016, 2017, whereas in 2010 and 2013 and so forth, when I worked there, it was fine. And they had a great deal there of materials pertaining to the Korean War. Shen Jihua, who was here at a conference maybe 6 or 7 years ago, was extremely helpful in gaining access to those, but even he now is having problems in seeing materials. So these show that Soviet espionage, the documents that have recently come to light in Moscow and also in Bulgaria, show that espionage played an important part in Stalin's decisions leading up to the outbreak of the Korean War. That's not especially surprising in that the Soviet Union had an extremely aggressive espionage network in numerous countries at the time, including China and North Korea, which pertained to this, but also still in the United States and Great Britain, where he was able to learn things that had a direct bearing on, or at least Molotov was able to learn things that had a direct bearing on Soviet decision making with regard to the prospect of a North Korean invasion. So the nature of Soviet relations with the new communist regime in China after the communists took power in China was also had an important effect. As we can now see, the Soviet Union had numerous Chinese officials who were reporting to it with or without Mao's knowledge, Mao Zedong's knowledge. So scholars in the past had thought that Soviet espionage was one of the crucial factors that influenced Stalin's thinking on these matters, but until recently, we lacked access to important archival records. Fortunately, over the past decade, at least until the 24th of February 2022, when things now are extremely uncertain about what the future of archival research will be, but up to then, as I will make clear this afternoon, the archival situation had actually been extremely good. We've been able to amass a substantial body of archival evidence to highlight the role of espionage. So even though the Central Archive of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia, the SVR as it's known through its Russian acronym, has never been made accessible. It's in Yasenevo on the southwest outskirts of Moscow. And I went there one time and spoke with the archive director, and I asked him whether the archive would ever be made accessible to researchers, and his answer was one word, which was nikogda, which means never. So I got my answer, but still, there are important copies of important records in quite a few archives that are accessible, both in Moscow and in other countries, especially East European countries, including Sofia and Bulgaria. So in these records do indicate, at least you can try to discern when these records influence Stalin's own decision making. It's not always clear what he looked at. In some cases it is, because you can see his handwriting on it. In other cases it's not, but at least records went to Molotov, which suggests that they also eventually, at least knowledge of them, reached Stalin. Stalin was not in Moscow during most of this period. He was staying at his dacha in Sochi, and so he was, the transfer of records to him was not always straightforward. There are also very important records in the former KGB archive in Kiev. That archive was fully accessible again until the war began. Now I have no idea when it will be accessible again, but from 2015, 2016 until February of 2022, it was accessible except for a while during the pandemic. But I was back there in January of this year, and everything seemed normal and fine. I wish it still were. So contrary to a widespread impression that access to Soviet archival collections in Russia essentially ended under Putin's authoritarian retrenchment, the opposite is the case, and that's the irony I want to stress, is even as the political situation in Russia deteriorated and Putin revived the autocratic practices of Soviet times, the situation with the archives was the opposite, that access and working conditions in the Russian archives actually improved a good deal, not deteriorated over the last decade. even a bit more than that, but particularly over the last decade, it got better and better, both access and working conditions. So until Putin launched his war against Ukraine on the 24th of February of this year, the situation in central Russian archives containing Soviet-era records was actually much better than at any time in the past. So again, at some point, when the war ends, it will be, I hope it will be practical to go back, and I hope the situation will still be as good. But that's the point I do want to stress, is there is fortunately a lot that's already available from those archives. As I mentioned, there is also a great deal available in Ukraine. Because I was in Bulgaria a lot over the last 2 years, I worked extensively in the Bulgarian archives, including the state security archives, and they had very close ties to what was then the Foreign Intelligence Service of the NKVD in Moscow, so they ended up with copies of quite a few important documents as well. So these are some of the archives in Moscow, the ones that are accessible. As I mentioned, the SVR archive is not accessible, and the presidential archive is not accessible. But a lot of the presidential archive records have been transferred to these archives, both Rigaspi and Rigani, that's Russian State Archive of Social Political History, and the Russian State Archive of Recent History, Noveshe. I translate it as recent. Some people translate it as contemporary, but that strikes me as Savdomnany, which used to be the name of the archive. So I prefer recent history. The Fund 17 is the enormous fund, the Central Party apparatus, but Opus 3 here, it pertains to what was called the Politburo at that point, so those records, they're important mostly because they've been accessible for a long time, but some of the Osobia Papki, the special special dossier or special files, were off limits until about maybe 15 years or so ago, and those contain some important materials pertaining to Korea, although more about the end of the Korean War rather than about the beginning. Fund 558 at Rigaspi is the Stalin-Lichny Fund, and there continue to be materials declassified in that fund, including as recently as when I was there in February. I saw materials pertaining to Japan from this period that had not been available before. The same is true with the Molotov-Lichny Fund, 82, and the Malenkov Lichny Fund and the Mikoyan Lichny Fund. These are all separate. Lichny Fund means personal collection. It's basically the papers that these leaders accumulated during their time in office. They were all members of the Politburo and all very senior officials in other capacities. And also at Rigani, the Khrushchev Lichny Fund 52, which has an enormous amount of material available now, including some important records pertaining to Korea. And most of all, the Suslov Lichny Fund. Mikhail Suslov was an important figure in the international communist movement during the Stalin period. He was an important, extremely important figure until the end of his life in the early 1980s. But during this time, he had high-level responsibility for contacts with communists of various sorts. And you can find in there files pertaining to Korea from the very period I was interested in looking at. And some of these do pertain to the role of espionage. I've put other archives here as well, which Katerina used, the Foreign Ministry Archive. There's a central archive of the Ministry of Defense, which has some useful records of the military operations in Korea and Soviet assessments of the Chinese operations. it turns out that Soviet officials were watching very closely how the Chinese military forces performed in Korea. Some of those records eventually made it to the Politburo. A lot of them I have no idea whether they did because they're quite voluminous. That last archive that I've listed there, that's the former KGB archive in Moscow, which in Kiev, Ukraine, that has copies of a lot of Central Soviet NKVD and KGB records. So which includes the foreign intelligence, and those are have a lot from this period relating to Korea. So let me, I don't know how much time I have. So I'm going to squeeze just about 3 more minutes. Is that okay? So having determined in the wake of the 1948-1949 Berlin crisis, this was the Berlin blockade, that military probes in Europe would be too hazardous, Stalin sought to expand Soviet influence in a region where there would be much less risk of a confrontation with the United States. Northeast Asia was the natural venue, which was not initially the case. It's quite striking how, in part because of the Berlin blockade and the formation of NATO in April 1949, that it changed those events which deal with Europe, nonetheless changed Stalin's view of Northeast Asia as well, coupled with the communist takeover in China, which was something that Stalin had thought would provoke U.S. intervention. That's very clear in a memorandum that Molotov had sent to Stalin. Stalin wrote a comment on it about something about that this will bring in the Americans, and of course it didn't happen. So Stalin, by late 1949, had come to suspect that, quote, the Americans are afraid of a war, unquote, in East Asia. That was in Stalin's conversation with Mao Zedong in Moscow when Mao came to Moscow from December 1949 through early 1950. And he stayed there for about 2 months. And the few conversations he was actually able to have with Stalin during that point have been available for a long while. There are also records that Molotov, who met with Mao quite a bit more during that period, also had with Mao. And so those shed some light on the way the outbreak of the Korean War. I know I'm rapidly running out of time, but let me just try to squeeze in just a few more of the slides. In January 1950, Stalin suddenly offered to meet with Kim Il-sung in Moscow to discuss how, quote, such an important matter as what Kim wishes to undertake in South Korea could be, quote, carefully prepared and organized so that the risk would not be so great. And soon thereafter, the Soviet Union began secretly providing large quantities of heavy weapons, support equipment, and planning advice to North Korea. You can find now in SAMO, the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense in Podolsky, you can find copies of the lists of weaponry that were going. They're not especially interesting, except to say, if you look at the quantities that were being provided, they're quite striking. Stalin invited Kim to come to Moscow in April 1950 to discuss what could be done on the Korean Peninsula. Catherine has written extensively about this, both in the working paper that she published a long time ago and in a chapter in a book that Arnie West had, Brothers in Arms, I think it's titled. Am I running out of time? Before deciding whether to permit a North Korean invasion, however, Stalin wanted to find out more about the situation on the Korean Peninsula and the nature of U.S. military commitments in the region. And so the timing of a speech delivered by U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson at the National Press Club in Washington on the 12th of January 1950 thus proved crucial. After perusing the text, Stalin concluded that the U.S., quote, defense perimeter, unquote, in East Asia was limited to Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Philippines, and that the United States would be unlikely to send troops to defend South Korea, quote, against military attack. Now, in a book that came out around 20 years or so ago, Sergei Goncharov and his co-authors, I believe it was John Lewis and one other, referred to Stalin as having seen the speech, but they didn't cite anything and they didn't provide evidence of it. Goncharov, because he has very good connections in the Russian archives, I suspect, was able to see it but wasn't authorized to disclose it. However, in this Fund 558 recently, a copy of it, I believe it was 2 years ago, a copy of the speech that Stalin actually saw, the text of it, which was translated into Russian. Stalin knew a little bit of English, but not well enough to read a whole speech. And so he had a translation into Russian, and you can now see where he actually marked it up, and he did refer to that passage. So Goncharov was actually accurate in referring to that in that book, even though he didn't provide any citation for it or evidence of it. And and it was there that Stalin referred to U.S. commitments, which I think was an extremely important factor in his decision-making. It's the issue that he brought up with Kim Il-sung over and over, and also with Mao Zedong. So I realize that I am probably testing your patience, but let me just say, in the weeks leading up to Kim's visit in April of 1950, Stalin sought additional assurance that there would not be, quote, too great a risk, unquote, of U.S. intervention on behalf of South Korea. And when Stalin met with Kim, he warned him that, quote, if you get kicked in the teeth by the United States, I will not lift a finger to help you. And of course, Stalin didn't quite stick to that, but he pretty well did. He was able to trick the Mao Zedong into committing Chinese forces. So Kim reassured Stalin that the United States would not respond with force, which of course proved to be untrue, but Kim argued that if the communist takeover in China had not been enough to provoke U.S. intervention, there was no chance that events in a much smaller country like Korea would spur the United States to act. And the quote, the specific thing he said was, America lost a giant, China, but still did not intervene. America will not take part in such a small matter as a war on the Korean Peninsula. That does seem to be, from the Soviet documents, that does seem to have been Stalin's general outlook at the time. And so this meeting reinforced a perception that Stalin already had. Mao was less confident of it. That's fairly clear from he worried that the United States would in fact intervene and that China would no longer have the opportunity to try to seize Taiwan, which had been occupied by the nationalist government after it fled the mainland. And so Mao did prove to be right on that, but Stalin was able to pressure him to commit to having China serve as a backup for North Korea if the United States did intervene. Stalin was pretty confident the United States would not intervene, and that's where, again, the role of espionage proved important, because Stalin did receive intelligence materials that shaped his or influenced his decision making, but some of the intelligence proved to be incorrect at the end. Not because the sources for it were necessarily wrong, it's just that calculations changed a great deal as events were moving rapidly. And part of the reason for that was that Berlin blockade had happened. So in an odd sort of way, this project that we're doing on European and Northeast Asia borderlands in an odd sort of way, events in Europe did influence events in Northeast Asia considerably because calculations changed on both sides as a result of actions taken in one continent or the other. So anyway, I'm sorry to go over, but I'll be speaking this afternoon and we'll be able to say a lot more about some of the collections.
Yeah, Dr. Kramer, thank you very much for your presentation and description of archives, and that information we can get from there. You made a huge work of researching and studying and visiting countries and spending there a lot of time and have this very, very difficult and full of very difficult work. Thank you. So, do you have any questions for paper presenter, for Dr. Kramer here? Please raise your hands. And please.
Yeah, I wanted to know if you've seen any archival reaction from Stalin when his initial assessment was proven wrong, that the United States wouldn't enter the war. So I was wondering, was there any reaction? And Stalin was pretty brutal when dealing with people who were, from what I understand, that were wrong or perceived to have not been honest to him. So was there any blowback on,
Yeah.
the espionage apparatus after that point?
Yeah, no, very good question. Stalin's mood changed over time. Initially when the U.S. intervention didn't go that well, he was actually quite exuberant. He thought that this would result in an embarrassing defeat for the United States. But then after the United States turned events with MacArthur, it turned events around, Stalin became very, how should I put it? Not angry is not quite the right word, but very pessimistic and worried about what would happen then, because he was worried that the United States would invade China and potentially try to the very thing that he thought was going to happen in 1949. He began to suspect that the United States, it hadn't intervened in 1949, but would, given the opportunity to go through Korea and to establish positions there and then to move in a larger way against the Chinese communists. So his mood changed a good deal. And that is reflected very much in a meeting that was held in Moscow in January 1951. The transcript from that meeting has not been made accessible, but the records from some of the participants are available. And so I wrote something about this, I don't remember when it came out, maybe about 10 years ago, but I can give you a copy of what was said at that meeting. But Stalin essentially thought that the United States was sort of the mirror image of what the US officials thought about Stalin and the Korean War. They thought that Stalin was using the Korean War as an opportunity to divert attention from Europe, and then he would launch an invasion of Europe. Stalin thought that the United States was doing the same with Korea, that it would use that opportunity to try to launch, NATO had been formed in April 1949, and that it would use that opportunity to try to launch a war in Europe. So Stalin gave a very sober and pessimistic speech at the January 1951 meeting in Moscow, in which he talked about that war was coming and that the Soviet Union and its East European allies had to be in a position to win it. By that point, he seemed fairly confident that the situation in Korea had stabilized enough that it was pretty much of a stalemate at that point. So he was no longer so fearful that the United States would march to try to overthrow the Chinese communists. He instead was worried that the United States was using the Korean War to keep Moscow off balance and then launch its own war in Europe. So he went through, changes of mood at that time. But with regard to the intelligence, he certainly berated Molotov several times, but Molotov wasn't really as much. He was not serving as foreign minister. He's still very much involved in foreign policy decision making, but he had been temporarily removed as foreign minister in 1949. So he was. It was unfair of Stalin to blame him as much, but it was. I think Stalin was never one who trusted intelligence fully. He tended to feel that people were trying to deceive him, and so he did make a few comments about that he had been misled, but there wasn't anything where he specifically focused on anyone beyond Molotov who he felt had misled him.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult for me to give opportunity for other questions because we have two paper presenters now in Moscow and in Paris with very big time difference. It's time for sleep for them. They are just sitting in front of their cameras and watching and participating so actively. So let's think about them and not to be so long in our presentations. So, yes, they are not turning off their cameras. They're so steadily with us. So we are very thankful for Laurent and for Katerina being with us all this time, even not leaving computers for the small rest. So thank you for them very much. So our next paper presenter will be also online, a professor from the United States, but the time difference with Seoul still allows him to be in a good mood, I think. So yes, Michael Devine from Wyoming University will have a speech about the two Korean divisions, the DMZ and memory. Please, Mike, it's your turn to have presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. Making this presentation virtually. I'm sorry for a couple of reasons. One is I'm not very good at technology. I don't want to press a button and suddenly just go blank here or disappear altogether. I'm also sorry because I can't participate in the great deals of assumptions that I'm sure all of you are enjoying there or meeting in person. So, well, maybe next time. Also, our son and his family are visiting us from Korea, from South Korea. He and his wife teach at Korea International University. Their 6-year-old son is here. You may notice my window in the back keeps moving. He keeps coming in wondering my grandpa isn't out playing with him. So let me see if I can get my camera running here without losing everybody and get underway. Hold on just a second. Okay, let me begin. This deals with the demilitarized zone and memory of the demilitarized zone in the countries, the major participants in the Korean War, and how that border is seen in memory and history. Since the signing of the armistice of 1953, that halted military operations along the DMZ that divides the Korean Peninsula, East Asia has experienced a remarkable period of secure borders, peace, and stability. The region has also enjoyed, since 1953, an unprecedented 7 decades of economic prosperity, except for the four people of North Korea. Okay, my technical assistant, I think, has solved my problem for me. However, in spite of the relative calm and material progress that has existed on the Korean Peninsula, problems remain. The North Korean regime threatens the South and its neighbors with nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. In addition, China has recently pursued a more aggressive foreign policy, challenging U.S. presence in the region and demanding reunification with Taiwan. Meanwhile, all the former combatants of the 1950-53 conflict hold vastly different public memories of the war as expressed in their popular media, educational systems, museums, monuments, and sites of remembrance. These deeply embedded, contested memories and conflicting histories hinder international efforts to secure a lasting peace in the tension-filled region, and perhaps eventually even reconciliation. Memories of war form an essential component for national identity and public memory. Public memory of war is clearly at work in the countries of East Asia. While memory is subjective and differs from fact-based history, the two are not binary. Indeed, both share the same space and evolve over time. Historical studies provide fact-based accounts of the past, but are not immune to subjective judgment. Memorials, meanwhile, commemorate wars and tragic events of warfare. But at the same time, they educate and can serve as places where people can get together to show their patriotic feelings, express grief, remorse, and sadness. Like historical studies, commemorative activities, and sites of remembrance also have the potential to provide for healing and the resolution for peace and justice. Here's my first slide. I hope you can all see this slide of MacArthur, the MacArthur statue at Incheon. Is that working? Okay, I'm assuming it is. Okay, nothing like the MacArthur statue, this memorial at Incheon, better represents the conflicted memories and contested history of the Korean War. And this is a picture I took several years ago of my late brother-in-law standing in front of the MacArthur statue, paying homage. He would go there in the evening sometimes and with a bottle of rice wine and 2 cups that he would place in front of the statue. And he would sometimes stay there all night, pouring a drink for himself and one for the general. And frequently, when he would leave in the morning, both cups were empty, so obviously the general. But this site was created in 1957 during the regime of Lee Sik-man, the authoritarian president of Korea, in order to remember the American general whose leadership Lee and his followers believed saved South Korea from communist domination, and who, if he had not been removed by President Harry S. Truman, would have united all of the Korean Peninsula under the control of the South Korean government. Lee was not alone in holding great admiration for General MacArthur and disappointment and contempt for President Truman. Indeed, it's my experience in Korean-American relations for more than 50 years that admiration, that feelings towards the administration of President Harry Truman, he is regarded as having responsibility for the division of Korea, and Koreans remember him for little else. As a result, his memorization or memorialization in Korea is much less grandiose than General MacArthur. This is a little statue of President Truman. It's probably about life size. He looks kind of like a little gnome here. And this is in a little sculpture garden in Imjindak along the DMZ. So you can see the contrast between the Truman statue and fact, Truman is responsible for the division of Korea twice. The first division came as a result of the Potsdam Conference. We heard about that in earlier presentations today. So let me move on then to the unintentional consequences of the Potsdam Conference, which seemed to be, in which Korea was a very minor issue and led 8 years later to a second division of Korea in 1953 at the Armistice Agreement, where a demilitarized zone roughly along the what had been the 38th parallel ended the Korean War and returned everything pretty much to the status quo antebellum. The Korean War and the armistice that ended it, at least ended the major military activities, but the war is still underway technically. The armistice dissatisfied everyone. Reed refused to sign the agreement on behalf of the South Koreans. The Chinese were frustrated that their intervention in Korea failed to drive the Americans and their allies into the sea. The North Koreans had nothing to show for their unsuccessful invasion of the South beyond millions of deaths and a ruined country. The Soviet Union acted as if they had no interest in the war, certainly not by 1953 and continuing the war. The two East Asian countries on the sidelines of the conflict that benefited most substantially from the war turned out would be Japan and the Republic of China, which was then based on Taiwan. Public memories of the Korean War and its consequences have greatly influenced the cultures, policies, and government actions of the nations involved. In the United States, Korea is often referred to as the Forgotten War, sandwiched between World War II and the long American nightmare in Vietnam. Yet Korea had an important impact on the United States. It hardened Cold War attitudes, enhanced the NATO alliance, and set a template for America's undeclared and limited wars in Vietnam and the Middle East. The public memory of the Korean War in the United States was fairly negative until the 1980s, when it began to change. Horrific images of POWs making false confessions, notions of brainwashing, ruined cities, orphans, these kind of gave way in the 1980s to a more positive view of Korea and a notion that maybe the Korean War was actually worth fighting. Korea had become a democracy. It soon, after the 1988 Olympics, which was kind of a showplace for Korea's progress, Americans began to feel, well, the war was worthwhile, and American veterans began to ask for their own recognition for their service and sacrifice. One aging American veteran was heard saying, you go to reunions of veterans and you find yourself remembering what you spent the last 50 years trying to forget. Let me show a couple more slides that kind of illustrate this point. This is a view of the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. On the Mall in Washington, D.C. There's this came after the Vietnam veterans had their own memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. and kind of caused the Korean War veterans to say, hey, what about us? Of course, the improved situation in Korea also inspired the veterans. This is a little kiosk on this, just maybe 50 yards away from the memorial, that has information about those who were killed or missing in action in the Korean War. And there was some discussion of putting plaques up along this memorial in Washington, D.C. with names of veterans, but that was discarded. But now it's been revised, and with a $20 million grant from the South Korean government, there will be a mall of remembrance in the Washington, D.C. Mall. And then here is a view of another state memorial. These things have proliferated all over the country in the last 30 years, again beginning in the late 1980s. This is Hawaii. The Hawaiian government was planning on a Vietnam Veterans Memorial when somebody said, hey, I had an uncle who fought in the Korean War. How about the Korean War? We've never memorialized that. So the Korean War was added as kind of an afterthought. And then, going back to my card here, excuse me. This is a memorial in Washington State, in Olympia, the capital of Washington, on the State House grounds. And again, you see the local involvement of the Korean American community. They were on the planning committee, and so great was the involvement and interest of the Korean American community in this state memorial in Olympia, Washington, that the text is written in both English and Korean. In North Korea, and the People's Democratic Republic, the war has always had only one narrative. It has never varied from the day the armistice was signed, and Kim Il-sung began creating his own special cult of personality that permeated every aspect of Korean culture. In fact, the Korean narrative is that the war was won almost single-handedly because of the great leadership of Kim Il-sung, his philosophy of juche, or self-reliance. There's almost no mention at all of aid from China or the authorization of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. This is pretty much neglected or eliminated from their narrative. The South Korean government has taken an entirely different approach to memorialization. This is a scene from Busan of the UN cemetery. The South Koreans have taken a position that their legitimacy as the true government of South Korea comes from their international support, not because they fought the war single-handedly with no outside assistance, which is a false narrative, but because they had UN support. They had the support of 16 UN nations, and they're very proud of that. You see it here in this slide of the memorial in Busan, where soldiers from many of the different countries that provided military aid, and some even who lost people in humanitarian aid, are buried. Of course, the Korean Memorial, the War Memorial, and the former headquarters of the 8th Army in Seoul, Korea, the first thing you see when you walk on the grounds are the flags of the many countries of the UN who supported the government of South Korea. And the South Koreans have been very proactive in recognizing veterans, not just veterans from the United States. This happens to be an American veteran. I took this photograph in 2016 at the Korean Military Academy, where young Korean officers, these two happen to be young majors in the Korean Army, were wheeling around former veterans of the Korean War, former members of the American military, but also members of any of the nations in the UN command are brought back for return visits. It's a really unique program, as far as I know, in the commemoration of warfare. Not all Koreans are appreciative of the American alliance or the American involvement in the Korean War. With democracy in the 1980s came the new openness that allowed for dissent and protest. Although I think that has largely dissipated in recent years. This is a photo I took in 2017 and showed not a a lot of people attending this anti-President Trump rally. China sees the war as an end to its century of national humiliation. The Chinese see themselves as having rescued their communist ally, the South Koreans, from complete domination, from being overrun by the North, from being overrun by the United States. In fact, they see things as
Unfortunately, I think it's on his end.
militarized separated
Dear Michael, do you hear us? Do you hear? We don't see you and no signal comes. As we are short of time, maybe we'll go to the next paper presenter and give Michael opportunity to finish his presentation later after connection will be re-established.
Have I connected or?
Now you are
am
connected,
I-
yes,
Yeah, you
yes.
broke off though, Mom.
And then not connected. And disconnected. So
Okay.
please try to continue, yes.
All right, let me just give you my, after all this, I'm not sure where it was that I was suddenly disconnected.
It was during, you were discussing the Chinese on the Chinese.
Okay, well, let me just say, of course, the Chinese have a much different view than the North and South Koreans or the United States. So, achievement of a permanent peace on the divided Korean Peninsula and efforts to produce a better outcome than provided in the 1953 armistice will require a commonly accepted fact-based understanding of historical realities, while at the same time allowing certain public memories
Oops, here we go again.
The connection is broken again. We don't hear you. The traffic is overloaded.
way.
Excuse me.
As diplomats endeavor to find peace, I don't know what
Dear Michael, we still cannot hear you. Let's try.
Okay, I'm just not sure what I can do about that, since, am I unmuted now?
Yes, yes.
At least
Okay.
temporarily.
Okay, well, I said I was unmuted before, but at any rate, my final word is that those seeking peace and permanent peace may find erasing national memories and conflicted histories to be more difficult than the removal of landmines and barbed wire along the DMZ. So that's my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry for disconnection. It's not because of technical problems, I think. So please, colleagues and who are here in the room or online, if you have any questions to Mike, please ask your questions via chat or directly. We can ask because the connection is now okay, restored. Any comments?
Just, I actually had a question, Mike, and if you get cut off, you can send me your response by email. But could you comment? I found your presentation extremely interesting, particularly
Yeah,
because.
no, say, Chad.
I'm sorry. Okay, I guess you can't hear me. So.
You can send it by email.
Yeah.
So, as connection is not so good, so let us communicate in the future by exchanging emails or using chat, which is now available for everybody who is participating online at our section. So let me give the turn to our last presenter who was with us during this more than 2 hours, to Dr. Laurent Kizefi, who will tell us about participation of curious questions and the UN Paris session took place on December 1948 as seen through the French press. Please, Laurent, it's your turn to present.
Yes, thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and old friends, I'm very glad to share with you the research I only began 3 weeks ago, that's only for this panel, and to deal with, can you read the presentation?
No, it's not out there yet. We can hear you fine.
And the presentation is okay for you?
No, we can still.
You'll have to the share screen.
Do you see something?
Still
No.
Not yet?
not yet.
Ah, friends, too bad.
No, just
The
try
share
to.
screen button at the bottom, and then you choose the PowerPoint.
Okay, let's see if I can. Okay, I see. And now, is it okay now?
Yes, yes, it's okay.
Yay!
Okay, wonderful. So, so I've begun with this new research 3 weeks ago, and in fact, the General Assembly held its work in Paris from 20th of September till the 12th of December 1948, and it was in, for those who know a little bit of Paris, Palais de Chaillot in Paris, it is Trocadero. Several important issues were on the agenda: the status of Palestine, former Italian colonies, human rights, atomic questions, disarmament, and Korea. And I especially tried to deal with the topic through the French press. And the corpus consists in newspaper published mainly in Paris, issued by movement, usually coming from the resistance, but I did not include communist publications. For first, I didn't want to lose time in the humanité propaganda and many violent propaganda in this case. And if dealing with humanité newspaper, I was compelled to go through the rest of the communist newspapers, like Ce Soir and Soir. I have also excluded the well-known Le Monde, unfortunately, Le Monde Daily, for practical reasons. This famous newspaper is only available to special fees or through microfilms, and I hope to get into this special archive later. I totally neglected the regional press, for too many people were available, and also because I don't know so well the political position of each of these titles. Well, the corpus is there was also some French newspapers in English, International Herald Tribune, but it was operated by the New York Times, so it's not so relevant. More interesting was Istanbul, French newspaper of Istanbul, with many informations dealing with international topics. But in fact, since we don't have so much time, I only focused on the French newspapers published in Paris. And the Third Assembly, sorry for the typos, had to debate about regional issues, Berlin, the question of Palestine, the Italian colonies in Africa, or Korea, and the Greek Civil War, and also about general questions, human rights, genocide crimes, verification, atomic energy, disarmament, and admission of new member states. After 3 months, most of the questions were not solved. Only the human rights and the genocide qualification and convention about what is a genocide and so on, what's a crime of genocide, have been solved by, adopted through the votes. Concerning Berlin, for instance, nothing was made, and only a neutral commission of experts was established. Palestine or other problems like Greece and Italian colonies were not solved also. And what we can read in the French newspapers is that most of the French newspapers explain that the Paris conference was not fruitful at all. The press pointed out the waste of time and money. Each word said, as you know, costed 170 francs, denars François at the end of his political sessions in December 12th. The statistical analysis also pointed that 2 million words were said by the delegates, 100 millions of pages have been printed. More important, 700 million francs have been spent by the UNO, and 1,000 million francs have been spent by France for the UNO. Since no significant results was reached, the balance sheet was not satisfying. And we have many other papers about one, the Catholic daily La Croix said negative balance sheet of the third session. And the popular evening daily François wrote the Palais de Chaillot administration installed 2 days before the end of the assembly large murals in front of the elevators leading to the conference room. It probably so that the delegates leaving their last meeting would be blushed with shame for the little they have accomplished in Paris. The Korean question was only debated from the 6th to the 12th December. Well, there was some, at first, an examination, a review of the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea reports, and it was a basis of the debates and the hearings about the Korean question. I have no time now to explain what was the United Nations Temporary Commission. I think everyone here know better than me this question. The proposal to invite a representative of North Korea was eventually refused through a general vote, and only a delegate from the South Korea was heard. Soon, the debates are marked by the strong opposition of the Soviet Union and its allies against the UNPOC and against the US policy in Korea. All the speeches are available through the United Nations Bulletin, and the report of the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea are also available on the UN research site. The Soviet propaganda contested the legitimacy of Seoul's government. Yakov Malik deeply criticized the US policy in South Korea. The elections were held in an atmosphere of state of siege. The police on horseback, the constabulary, the American armored cars have been mobilized to force the population to take part in the election, he said. All the members of the Seoul government are former collaborationists, he said also. Though the Soviet propaganda thus tried, clumsily perhaps, so much there was an accumulation of various accusations, untruths, and inventions to manipulate minds and sow doubt among the delegates of the political committee. This is an article from the Figaro, Le Figaro. And also the Ukrainian delegate, Mr. Maluninsky, criticized in the same way the US policy in South Korea. However, I had the opportunity 20 years ago to meet with a close observer to the United Nations Temporary Commission, Monsieur Jean Medmore, who was a young diplomat in Seoul at the time, and he supported the works of the French delegates at the United Nations Temporary Commission, and he could not be suspected of any condescendence towards communism, but reported many years later acts of torture from the Korean police, and he also said the Sigmund Rhee government was really a dictatorship. The vote recognizing the legitimacy of the Seoul government was announced in advance several days before the votation, proves that the opinions have already been settled. The UNO recognizes today the legitimacy of the government in Korea, and most of the final resolution is already in in mind, and this is only December 9th of 1948. Lacroix, already mentioned Catholic Daily, asks on the same days, December 9th, will the Korean imbroglio be the last problem raised at Chaillot? The Korea First still takes center stage in the political commission. This will undoubtedly be the last item on the agenda to be examined by the body chaired by Mr. Spaak. Mr. Spaak was a Belgian Prime Minister at the time. The jury discussion is closed on this Korean affair. It is Thursday evening that the vote would take place. We can predict that the Sino-American Australian resolution tending to recognize the legitimacy of the Seoul's government will be adopted. This text further recommends to the occupied power in Korea to withdraw their troops, as well as the creation of an organization to monitor the evacuation of troops and work for the unification of the territory. In the Figaro, so day before, the text is interesting for the political commission is going to close his work, and Prime Minister Spaak, the chairman, warned the first commission that he had to close its work the same evening because the sessions were taking too much time. And most of the political commission approached the discussion of the Korean problem without enthusiasm, quite convinced, it seems, that it will never be able to find a solution to it within the time allowed. This is quite interesting, I think. On the same way, other commissions were qualifying crime of genocide or the question of the human rights and so on. And the question of genocide, the human rights declaration were topics, matters more important than Korea, perhaps. At least in the eyes or in the minds of French press. Delegates, delegates. Also, Le Figaro showed severe critics against the delegates. He wrote, "For 48 hours, we have been living in Chaillot in an atmosphere very much reminiscent of that of a college on the eve of the holidays, much less attendance by students or other delegates, including some who are more concerned with choosing the gifts they will bring back from Paris to their families than with the future of Italian colonies or the fate of Korea." I think this is meaningful, very significant of the state of mind of the delegates. However, earlier, on the same week, Le Figaro again published a very interesting and a very accurate description of the Korean situation and with solutions, perhaps, to solve the Korean problem. The United Nations must avoid to turn the Korean problem into a Greek affair, into the Greek affair of the Far East, he wrote, warning about the risk of civil war in Korea. And the paper developed the idea that the division was absurd, and he recommended that the political commission try to reach a conciliation through a federal system in order to restore the economic complementarity between North and South. This text also warned against the solution of a majority vote recognizing only the South government because he thought a majority vote against the North, the Pyongyang government would solve nothing. On the same paper, we also can read that the political commission will think carefully before closing the debate with a majority resolution which would not solve anything in practice. That is concerned above all with the future and resolutely faces the realities of the present situation. People's Republic in the north, Republic of Korea in the south. The Commission has a duty to take the time to elucidate intentions itself or through a subcommittee working during the Christmas break, whether there is a possibility that Washington and Moscow will leave the two rival regimes constituted in Korea to respond to the almost unanimous wish of their fellow citizens by gradually abolishing at first in the economic order the absurd and debilitating barrier of the 38th parallel. It's very interesting to go back to the United Nations Temporary Commission's on Korea reports, which warns about the risk of war and pointing out the question of the division and its absurdity. All Koreans, regardless of their political affiliations or social standing, are united in their condemnation of this disunity. The Commission maintains the view that for the social, political and economic well-being of Korea, an immediate unification is absolutely essential. On the other hand, even though it is realized that effective jurisdiction of the government established in Seoul does not extend to the north, the view is held that this government has provided the basis from which it may be possible to proceed to unification by peaceful methods of negotiation, at least in the economic field, where such unity is of vital importance. It is the opinion of the Commission that the need for setting up some procedure for peaceful negotiation is urgent and must take place before military evacuation of the occupying forces, abandon Korea to the arbitrary rule of rival political regime whose military forces might find themselves driven to internecine warfare. However, the UN Commission recognizes that because it feels that the task of defining method of peaceful relations between the governments of North and South Korea would be futile so long as opposing ideologies and politics to which they subscribe continue in opposition to each other. For this reason, and inasmuch as all the objectives envisaged in the General Assembly resolution of November 14, 1947, have not been fulfilled, the Commission is of the opinion that the General Assembly should remain seized of the problem, seek the full cooperation of all member states, and take such other steps as it may deem fit to bring about the attainment of the national independence and unity of Korea. It was the first paragraph of the UN Temporary Commission report. Then to conclude, and this is a preliminary conclusion after 3 weeks of research only, I think that the UN Commission report were not taken in consideration in deep. The political commission was urged to conclude as quickly as possible, since the UNO delegates were on the leave for Christmas holidays, and then to go back to Lake Success in spring. It was the 1st of April that the new session was supposed to begin. The Soviet delegates and their allies criticized so deeply the US policy in South Korea so that nobody eventually saw any truth in their speeches. So the repressive character of the Southern regime was known by some Western diplomats and especially by the UN temporary commissions, the delegates. No attempt of real conciliation in order to restore at least the economic complementarity of Korea was attempted, at least during the Paris session, and the risk of civil war was totally neglected. The UN Temporary Commission stopped its work. A new commission was established finally, and I think it's not by chance that the French delegate of the United Nations Temporary Commission did not want it to be a member of the new commission. And the political commission was urged to complete, also, this is a vis repetita. The Soviet delegates, this is the same thing. Well, to conclude exactly, I think that men of goodwill and zealous diplomats confronted perhaps with the coldest of cold monsters at Nietzsche once defined the state. In the divergent concert of member nations at the UN, Korea was now only the pretext for oral jokes to disseminate propaganda on the both sides, and the overriding interest of the Korean people was irrelevant. No one in 1948 knew Korea. Only the most zealous members of the Temporary Korea Commission had attempted to warn, to recommend conciliation, and even to demand that the majority votes be postponed so as not to crystallize the Korean Soviet, the US Soviet position. Perhaps it was really too late, since the founding of the Pyongyang government, just after the one in the south, already perhaps crystallized the two positions. However, while diplomats of goodwill confronted the logic of states called monsters, the others preferred to think about the choice of that Christmas gift. No one seems to have brought thought of offering unification and peace to the Koreans. Thank you.
Dear Laurent, thank you very much. We are hearing here the signal which asks us to finish all our activities here right now, because it's the time for what? Maybe for lunch? I don't know.
North Korean invasion.
Yes, no, it's just South Korean invasion into our panel. Thank you very much for your very, very important and very interesting paper based on primary sources on newspapers, and you just introduced us very interesting view of French, not only newspapers but French government, French politicians.
It deserves a more accurate investigation, especially in the in the world of foreign affairs in France also. But since it's entirely a new research,
Yes.
I'm only focused on the newspaper for this time.
And I think that you will prepare some paper, or maybe it will be a part of your big book or research, because everybody needs to see your paper in a form of an article or in a form of a book, I think, or monograph. notwithstanding that we have spent so much time, and Laurent also spent a lot of time deep at night in Paris waiting for its turn to present his paper. I think that we have to ask, we must have time for asking him questions connected with his presentation. Have everybody questions about what just heard here in this auditorium? Or comments about presentation made by Laurent Gizefi? Just hear silence and
If Mike is still on, can I ask him?
And if you permit me, I want to give just one comment on what is going on here during this panel and presentation of all the papers here we heard, because my comment is comparatively sharp and it's very important, so sorry for giving it. We are discussing here the Korean question from the point of view of superpowers. We do not consider the role of Koreans in the process of division of Korea. Aren't Koreans also responsible for division of Korea too? What was their efforts and position and activities for unification of Korea or against division of Korea maybe? So I think that to better understand the question of division and the later Korean War, we must consider not only the role of superpowers who liberated Korea from Japanese colonial rule, but also keep in mind and to consider the role of Koreans, of Korean politicians, Korean leaders, Korean parties, Korean people, their will, and so and so and so. So if we combine research and study both of what did superpowers and of Koreans together, I think that we will be able to understand better the processes which led to division of Korea. Thank you. Thank you for all paper presenters, especially for who are online with us, for Ekaterina, for Laurent, for Mike, because especially for Ekaterina and Laurent who spent the whole night together with us without interruption, without sleep, without a cup of coffee, as I saw. So thank for them very, very much, because I know what is spending a night and listening to papers and waiting for your own turn and presenting. You're very fatigued, très fatigué en français, so tired. Absolument, so tired. So thank you for all presenters, for all participants, for all questions, and I hope that this panel will be resulted in some common publication or maybe in a journal or somewhere. Thank you. Maybe Professor Min will have some comments. So if we have any questions, so let me terminate this very fruitful and interesting panel. We are a little bit late, but it's so difficult to be together, to unite, to come to Korea from far abroad, especially, of course, the pandemic is about to be finished, but anyway, we're still far from returning to our normal lives. So thank you for all participants, for all paper presenters, for all who came to this auditorium and was with us during all this panel. Thank you.
그 다음 세션 준비되어 있으니까 우리 참가자들 같이 기념사진 빨리 한번 찍고 나갑시다. 다들 왔습니다.
Our next session is already, so all the participants, could you just come out and take a picture together?
뒤로 가고. 그럼 잠깐만. 잠깐만. 뒤로.
Oh, yeah, the picture will be here.
여기서.
You are moving away.
She was saying move out outside.
요 앞에서.
Yes, it's better. So phase